Welcome, everyone, to this afternoon's lecture. And we're very pleased to be able to have as our guest speaker this afternoon, Dr. Lewis Darwen, who's an Honorary Research Fellow at London Metropolitan University. His most recent publications, I believe, are books on the removal of Irish paupers from Britain from 1819 up to the early 20th century, published in 2024, and another book, The Death Sentence of Black 47, Eyewitness Accounts of Ireland's Great Famine, published in 2023. Now, this afternoon, he's going to talk to us on aspects of the Preston strike and lockout of 1853 to 54, and concentrating particularly on the subject of knobsticks. Over to you, Lewis. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks very much, Roger. Hi, everyone. Okay, so as Roger alluded to there, I'm going to talk today about Preston strike and lockout, and I call it a strike and lockout because it was both. So sometimes you'll see this industrial dispute referred to as a strike, sometimes as a lockout. It was both. It started as a strike, it became a lockout, and it ended as a strike. So strike and lockout is a more accurate phrase, although it's a little bit cumbersome. And I'm going to focus on aspects of violence and intimidation and question some ideas around this industrial dispute being kind of uniquely or almost universally peaceful, which is kind of how it's often depicted. So this is a lecture based on an article that was published last year in the Historic Society of Lancashire and Cheshire in a special edition that was edited, or a special collection that was edited by myself, Dr. Andrew Hobbs, who is with us today, and Jack Southern at the University of Central Lancashire. And we were trying with that to kind of bring together scholars to kind of look at the lockout in a new light, or in a kind of I suppose in a different way to how it had been depicted in the past. The image here, it's worth just kind of focusing on for a moment. This depicts a mass meeting at a relatively early phase of the lockout at the Orchard in Preston. This is where the Preston Covered Market currently is. At the time, it was a big kind of open area in Preston town centre, and it was a popular meeting place for the working classes. The chap standing in the cart there is George Cowell. He was a Preston weaver. So this image, by the way, is from the Illustrated London News, reporters from which came to Preston to observe the strike, and artists drew images from what they observed. George Cowell was a Preston weaver, and he very much became the kind of leader of the union leader during the strike. There were others as well, but Cowell was the most notable. And around Cowell, we can see a huge kind of mass of people, hundreds, maybe even thousands of people coming to hear his speeches about about kind of the importance of the strike and maintaining solidarity and that kind of thing. There's a couple of things to pick out here. I mean, first of all, what we can see in the foreground of this image is a number of women. So we can see that, I don't know if you can see my cursor there, there's a couple of women in the foreground there, and another one to the right. And if you kind of look throughout the image, you can kind of see depictions of what looks like women. And it's really important to kind of recognize that by the 1850s, textile manufacturing, particularly in the weaving sector, was dominated by women. It was not dominated by men. So when we think of industrial disputes, we tend to think of working class men. Actually, in the Preston lockout, strike and lockout, most of those involved were first of all young people, but secondly, predominantly women. Now, the spinning sector, and spinners were involved in this dispute as well, was predominantly a male occupation, partly because the machinery was a bit more kind of technical, but also heavier. So spinning was dominated by men, but the weaving sector was dominated by women. And what we wanted to do, I think what I wanted to do with this article, and what we wanted to do as a collective when we did this special edition, was focus much more on the masses of people, these people here, the operatives, who were involved in this dispute and who spent 6 months of their lives in the summer of 1853, early 1854, out of work, demanding higher wages because this was a dispute over wages. We wanted to focus much more on the experiences and the motivations of those people, and to give agency to those people, much more than focusing on the trade union leaders and the cotton lords, the masters, who have up to this point received the most attention. So that was very much what we wanted to do. And I think in terms of kind of an underpinning kind of motivation to do this special edition, it was about kind of giving agency to those who were involved, to the massive operatives who were involved. So what are the origins of this study then? Well, 2023-24 marked the 170th anniversary of the beginning and the end of the strike and lockout. So this is a dispute that begins in the summer of 1853 as a strike and runs through to May 1854. So the time frame of this varies depending on there's no official starting point, but there's a series of strikes in the summer of 1853, beginning around August time, running to September. The lockout phase, I'll go into this in more detail shortly, but the lockout phase begins in October and it runs through to February, and then it becomes a strike again that runs until May. So the beginning and end of this dispute, kind of 2023-24, marked the 170th anniversary of that. And we wanted to do something, and we kind of used that as an excuse, I suppose, to look at the lockout with a kind of from a different lens. The starting point for this, in terms of how we approached it, was to go back to the work, the book by H.I. Dusson and J. King, 10% and No Surrender, the Preston Strike, 1853 to 54. There's an image of the front of the book there. This is the only kind of major study of the lockout. There's been the lockout has been mentioned in a lot of kind of books about kind of trade unionism and industrial relations. It forms an important place actually in kind of labor history and trade union history, but has only received kind of singular attention in the book by Dutton and King. This was a book that had received something of a mixed response when it was published. So it received some criticism for not being theoretical enough. It was very much a narrative history. It was kind of unabashedly a narrative history. It told what the authors themselves described as just interesting stories. But those stories focused mainly on the trade union leaders and who they were and what they were kind of demanding, and focused on the cotton lords, or the cotton tyrants as they were sometimes known, and the conflict between those two. So very much a class conflict dimension between the trade union leaders and the kind of mill owners. Doesn't say very much about the operatives at all, and doesn't say anything at all about women. And this was something that King, in an interview that Robert Poole at the University of Central Lancashire conducted as part of this project, this kind of reappraisal of the lockout that we did, that he conducted an interview with King, and King acknowledged that actually, if we did this again, we would do more on the operatives, and we would certainly do more on women. So it was kind of an oversight, but we used this as a kind of as a way, I suppose, to shape our own study. What did Dutton and King look at? What did they argue? How might we build on what they've done in order to shed a new light on the lockout, based on kind of 40 years of historiography that had happened since the book was published in 1983. So there are some examples of this. I mean, I suppose most of the articles in a way focus more on the operatives, but there are some in particular that stand out. Andrew Hobbs has written on the strike balance sheets, which include, the balance sheets are kind of financial reports that include all the donations sent to the union by operatives mainly, but the operatives sometimes include verses of poem or kind of nicknames, or even sometimes veiled or explicit threats to those who are not taking part in the strike in those balance sheets. So in a way, we kind of capture the kind of voices of the operatives in those balance sheets, which is really interesting. Janet Greenlee's focused on female operatives and their experiences during the strike, and shedding new light on kind of what might have motivated them to be part of this 6-month dispute and to maintain support for the strike during that period, that long period of time when they had no work and they were surviving on relatively small handouts, mainly from the union, from the trade union, that is, rather than the polo union, although some of them did receive poor relief as well. And Marcin O'Cathane did a really interesting study on Irish operatives. Now, the Irish are typically associated with knobstick labour, those who were brought in to kind of blackleg or scab labour to work and to undermine the strike. What Marcin argues, what he finds, and I think what he demonstrates quite clearly, is that many Irish were also involved in the strike themselves as strikers, and even some of them were kind of heavily, very influential within the strike. So they weren't just knobstick labourers from Ireland. And in fact, most of the knobsticks that were brought in, I'll go on to talk more about what knobstick means, by the way, who they were, but most of them were kind of brought in from England and rather than Ireland. But the idea of knobstick comes firmly attached to the Irish, partly because there's a series of cartoons that were not published but became popularised at the time and subsequently. One of them is here on the front of Dutton and King's book. And these are a series of kind of cartoons that depict the influx of Irish knobsticks into the mills and the chaos that kind of arises out of the use of these knobstick labourers, none of whom, according to these cartoons, know what they're doing. They're all kind of uncivilized, and and it's just it creates these depictions of a chaotic environment. And it's an attempt to undermine what the cotton masters were doing by bringing in imported labour. But the knobsticks are all Irish, and it's kind of underpinned by a sort of anti-Irish prejudice, presenting the Irish as being uncivilized and unskilled and kind of useless and all these kinds of things. But Alcathane shows that isn't quite the case. What I wanted to do, though, with my article, is to question this idea that the strike was kind of universally peaceful. This is something that the Dutton and King very much kind of lean into in their own work. They're sympathetic towards the strikers and their motivations, and they argue repeatedly that the operatives were kind of peaceful, and that there was a lack of violence and conflict during this strike. More broadly, in terms of kind of historiography, the Preston strike is often used as an example of union activity moving away from the sort of kind of violence and kind of radicalism of the 30s and 40s towards more kind of peaceful negotiation in the second half of the 19th century. Ideas that underpin this are, the decline of popular radicalism by the 1850s, the decline of the kind of revolutionary fervor of the 20s and 30s. But also, it's been argued that society became more civilized in the second half of the 19th century. So union activity became much more about negotiation rather than violence. I think there's a lot of truth to that, but also there are many counterexamples. The Sheffield outrages, for example, in the 1860s, where there was a lot of violence and intimidation, is very much kind of goes against that idea of peacefulness. Nonetheless, I think there's some truth to it. But I think what I want to argue with this is that, yes, it is true that there was no, I think that the strike and lockout was kind of devoid of a political undercurrent in a way that earlier strikes were not. Even in Preston in 1842, for example, there's a kind of notable kind of industrial dispute that became known as the Plug Plot riots, where the military were drafted in and 3 people were shot and killed. And Chartism kind of influenced some, that particular episode. That we don't see that in the 1850s. It is the case that politics does appear to have pulled away from the kind of motivating factor within this strike. Nonetheless, what I argue is that when you turn attention away from class conflict, in other words, conflict between the union leaders and the employers, and turn attention towards conflict within the working classes themselves, and in particular between those who supported the strike and those who did not, you find much more instances of kind of intimidation and violence that has kind of been ignored by this focus on class conflict. My own approach to this was influenced by other studies that have looked at this kind of conflict within classes rather than between. Darlington in 2022 has published a book called Strikers versus Scabs that looks at the long history of conflict within classes during periods of industrial action from the 19th century into the 20th century. And Downing, in a study of the Sheffield outrages of the 1860s, does the same. And they say, yes, we might argue in a broad sense that union activity becomes more peaceful. The violent clashes of the past are become less current or less common. However, when we turn attention towards towards conflict within classes, and how those who kind of supported the strike tried to maintain solidarity within the movement by intimidating and threatening violence to those who don't support the strike, what we find is something of a different picture. And that's what I try to do in this paper, to kind of demonstrate examples of that. Okay. So there are lots of examples of this idea that the Preston strike and lockout was peaceful. Charles Dickens, of course, famously came to Preston in early 1854, February 54. and writes about what he spends a few days in Preston, and he attends some meetings of the trade unions, and he tends meets some of the cotton lords, and he just generally kind of immerses himself within the town and speaks to some of the operatives. He's very sympathetic towards the workers, although he's very much on the fence in terms he doesn't agree with the strike, although it's not a strike, it's a lockout at this time. He doesn't really agree with the kind of what the operatives have done to lead in terms of leading to this this kind of dispute. He doesn't agree with cotton laws either. He thinks it's just a disaster for everyone involved. But he's very sympathetic towards the workers in terms of their suffering and their plight, even if he doesn't necessarily agree with them politically, although I get the sense that he probably does. But he says neither by night nor by day was there any interruption of the peace of the streets. In other words, he's kind of exerting this idea that despite the suffering that these people are experiencing, this is several months into the dispute, there's no interruption of the peace of the streets. And this is part of a wider argument that he makes about the fact that the workers involved are, going about their kind of not kind of radical or kind of they're not an angry mob or anything like that. The Times newspaper and the strike, this episode receives a lot of attention locally and nationally. And the Times newspaper reports at the end of the dispute in May, for 8 long months, thousands of men have endured privations little short of famine, have repeatedly assembled in large bodies for the consideration of what they believe their wrongs, and have seen their opponents at first succeeding and at last successful, because this was a failed the working classes, the operatives failed to get their wage increases, so it was a failure in that sense. They succeeded and at last successful without the smallest disturbance of the public peace or alarm of the public mind. So very much again leaning into this idea that this was a universally peaceful moment of industrial action. Clemesher, who was a historian of Preston, wrote in 1912, with the exception of a few offences of intimidation and assault committed by certain of the strikers, the whole of the long dispute was conducted in a manner which reflected the highest credit on both parties. I'll be focusing a bit more on this intimidation and assault that Clemesher acknowledges but kind of ignores, because I think it's more significant than he argues. And Dutton and King themselves in 10% and No Surrender argue that, and this is kind of their overarching view on kind of violence and intimidation. They argue that there was no violence, just peaceful, if energetic persuasion. And again, I think the terms if energetic is doing a lot of heavy lifting there in terms of undermining the importance of some of this intimidation. There are some contrasting perspectives. So Henry Ashworth, he writes the first history of the lockout in 1854. Ashworth, it's important to note, was no friend of the operatives. He was a mill owner himself, very much aligned with the motivations of the mill owners. So this is a very partisan study. But he argues that the methods of coercion adopted were very various. If a man ventured to go to his work, he was at once branded with dishonor. He was no longer a man, but a knobstick. Ashworth tries to make the point that most of the workers involved in this dispute, many of whom he emphasizes were women, had no kind of political or ideological desire to take part in this strike, that most of them didn't really support it, that they went along with it because they knew that not going along with it meant they would face kind of intimidation and perhaps violence as knobsticks, right? I don't agree with that. I think he takes that point too far. But I do think he's right in emphasizing the importance of intimidation in kind of sowing kind of collective solidarity, as I'll go on to explain. And Anthony Hewitson, who is another historian of Preston, wrote in 1883, he says, the Preston lockout, of course, created much excitement in the public mind, much anger amongst the operatives, and much depression in the general trade of the town. He doesn't emphasize the kind of peacefulness. He kind of, he focuses more here, I think, on kind of the anger and the disruption that it causes, which is a little bit different to Clemesher's interpretation in 1912. So different perspectives here on the role of kind of peace or how peaceful this episode was, and kind of the role of violence and intimidation within it. Just very quickly, I think, you might not all be aware of kind of what happened during this this dispute. I thought it'd be useful just to give a brief. It's very complicated, like everything is, like all history is. It's very complicated, but just to give a brief timeline of what happened. It is important to acknowledge that this dispute was not unique to Preston. So this was a regional demand for higher wages that actually started in southeast Lancashire around Stockport and Manchester in early 1853 and kind of moved domino-like northwards over the course of the first half of 1853. And it happened partly because, I mean, mainly because the late 40s was a period of economic depression. 1847 to 48 in particular was a really bad time for the industrial economy. Lots of unemployment, lots of mills working part-time, short-time hours, many kind of business, organizations going out of business. Pauperism rates skyrocketed. So for around 18 months, the industrial economy was in a really bad way. And the masters implemented almost universal wage reductions during that period, on the promise, it was later argued, that those wages would be increased when times got better. It was very clear by the early 1850s that times had got better. So the 1850s, the early 50s starts the mark of kind of starting point of a mid-Victorian boom. The industrial economy is doing really well. It's recovered from the late 40s. We know this partly because lots of mills are being built. There's a big demand for labour. And the workers start to demand the reinstatement of the wage reductions that were implemented in the late 40s. And there's some pushback against this. It's the first real case of this, the first real test case in terms of how this was going to play out is in Stockport. In the early 1853, the Stockport operatives start demanding wage increases. The popular mantra, 10% and no surrender, isn't a Preston thing. It's not from the Preston lockout. It starts in Stockport, and it later becomes the mantra across the whole region. The Stockport strike is successful, interestingly enough. The operatives win. It lasts a couple of months. And in the end, the employers kind of concede to the wage demands of the operatives. And the expectation is, the reason Stockport, the eyes of the region were on Stockport, because the expectation was that whatever happened in Stockport would lay the groundwork for what happened elsewhere. So if in Stockport the operatives win, likelihood is the masters in all the towns will give general wage increases. And that is what happened initially. So in town after town, what we see after the Stockport episode ends is the masters start giving higher wages to their employers, to their employees, including, interestingly enough, in Preston. So by the summer of 1853, most of the masters in Preston had agreed to a 10% increase in wages, including the major employers like Horrocks, which is the biggest employer in Preston. He agrees to the wage demands of the employers. A small number of employers, however, in Preston steadfastly refuse to increase wages, and this leads to strike activity, and it leads to a perception amongst the employers that a kind of radicalism is starting to creep into some of the workers. They are kind of going on strike, and they are demanding others go on strike and causing disruption. And the masters really dislike this. And the Masters Association, which is a body that had existed for about a decade in Preston up to this point, and Preston had a history of very tense industrial relations. The Masters Association basically decide that they're going to do a universal closure of the mills in order to kind of teach the workers a lesson. Dustin and King describe it as an episode in mastery. The masters want to exert their authority. So even though most of them had agreed to wage increases, because some strike activity had persisted, they shut the mills and tried to kind of cut out this kind of undercurrent of anger amongst the workers and to exert their own authority. And this is why the lockout begins in Preston, and it's why this episode becomes particularly focused on Preston, and why Preston becomes the kind of most notable example of kind of this industrial action of the early 50s. So in October 53, the Associated Masters closed their mills. A small number of mills do stay open, so not all masters were in the Associated Masters, but probably around 80%, it's estimated, around 80% of workers were locked out. And this is the official starting point of the lockout. In December 1853, some of the masters, the Associated Masters decide not to reopen the mills, but to kind of open themselves up to applications for employment. In other words, they get a sense that some of the workers might be willing to go back, so they open themselves up to applications. Very few workers, it appears, applied, and the mills don't reopen. In January 54, Hollins, who was one of the masters who locked up his mills, reopens his mill. The reason he does that is he's not part of the Masters Association. Now, the Masters Association all agreed that if any of their members opens their mills without the collective agreement of the majority, they would forfeit £5,000. Hollins, however, isn't a member of the Masters Association. He locks up his mill in solidarity with the Masters in September, but he's not part of that association, so he can reopen his mill without forfeiting £5,000. He does that, and some workers go back, but most don't. In February 54, the Masters Association declare their mills open. Very few employees, however, it appears, go back. Some mills just can't really function. They stay open, but they can't function because there's just no hands going into them. In late February, the masters therefore decide to import knobstick labour. This is imported workers who are brought in order to undermine the strike and to get workers working in the mills. Some of those come from Ireland, so there are, we know that some come out of the Belfast workhouse, for example. Some paupers from the workhouse in Belfast come over to Preston to work. Most of them, however, come from other areas in the north of England, some as far as Scotland, some from the south of England, but mainly from the kind of villages around the north of England. So actually, the importation of knobstick labour happens relatively late in the strike or in the dispute. And in May 1854, the strike ends in defeat for the operatives. Basically, they had kind of reached a point where it just couldn't continue. The resources were running out that had sustained them during the strike, and it had to end. I suppose a sort of strike fatigue had set in, and at that point, the workers go back and they don't get the wage increase. So this is an episode of failure, and it's not even an episode that, it's not remembered in a kind of as a glorious failure. Actually, and it's something that we kind of talk about in the introduction to the special edition. It's kind of remembered as a tragic failure. It's not something that the working classes draw upon to get kind of as a kind of instant, a successful episode of collective solidarity like Peterloo was, or something like that, or the Tolpuddle martyrs was. There were no martyrs from the lockout. It just seems a spectacular failure, and for that reason was largely forgotten for a long time. Okay, just so I want to look then at some instances, I suppose, of kind of intimidation and kind of tease out the role that intimidation might have played, or what I argue did play in maintaining solidarity amongst the workers. And I'll do that through a series of vignettes, so a series of case studies. These case studies are taken mainly from newspaper reports of petty sessions of individuals brought before the magistrates. So trial cases, basically, of individuals who are brought before the authorities accused of intimidating or enacting violence. So the first episode here is the assault and intimidation of a chap named Alexander Kay. Alexander Kay was an operative at Hawkins Mill in North Preston. I've circled the mill here. It's on the map here, labelled as Greenbank Mill. Alexander Kay was a 60-year-old twister-on at Hawkins Mill. He'd worked there for a long time. He was very loyal to his employer. He didn't agree with the strike. So this is September 53, by the way, right at the start of this dispute. Or it's not a lockout at this point. It's a strike. People have been turning out. The operatives at Greenbank Mill have been turning out for about a week prior to this. Alexander Kay, as I say, didn't support the strike. He refused to pay union fees or any financial support for the union, and he refused to turn out. And this meant that he was labelled a knobstick. And in early September 53, a large kind of gang of individuals, observers estimated 300 to 400, mainly young men and women, or teenage men and women probably, but some older adults as well, gathered outside the mill, waiting for those who were working in the mill to leave. And Alexander Kay said this when he was brought before the court 2 days later. So this is his testimony. He says, "On Monday, I left work at the usual time to go home. And when I got outside, I saw a great number of persons collected between the factory and my house." This was his house here, by the way, on St. Peter's Street. So it's a few minutes walk from the mill. St. Peter's Street, if anyone knows Preston or the University of Central Lancashire, this is where the University Library currently is, right on this point here. This St. Peter's Church is still there, by the way. The library is here. So it's a relatively short walk. He says, "I saw a great number of persons collected between the factory and my house, and they began to shove me and shout. They called me knobstick and grey-haired thief. The greatest part of the crowd were girls and boys. There were a few men there." He gives further testimony. He talks about how his hat was kind of shoved off his head, how he was pushed over a few times. He does say that he didn't particularly feel intimidated. He didn't feel that, he kind of, at one point during this journey back to his house, he kind of stands on the street corner and harangues the group and kind of, I suppose, defends his actions for why he's still working. So he doesn't feel particularly intimidated. However, it's perceived to be an act of intimidation, an attempt to stop Alexander Kay from going to work. There are some arrests for this. So Thomas Geldard, 17-year-old. I mean, most of those are young adults. This is entirely in keeping with the general demographic of factory workers. Most of them were younger adults. I mentioned earlier that many of those who worked in factories were women, but actually they were younger women, because what tended to happen is that women would leave that employment when they had children, and they might go back thereafter, but there was always that moment. So it's really a younger, factory employment is mainly a younger person's game, and in the weaving sector, mainly female. But Thomas Geldard, age 17, we don't know much about Geldard, but he was arrested and the first person to be prosecuted for intimidation and violence during the Preston strike and lockout. He was accused of assaulting and intimidating Alexander Kay, and was considered by the arresting officer as just being the worst in the crowd. I mean, it seems to me, reading between the lines, that he was just one of those who were involved that was kind of caught by the authorities. And he was charged under the Workmen's Combination Act of 1825, which made it illegal to obstruct people to prevent them working. In other words, if somebody was intimidating someone to stop the work, was physically stopping them going to work, they could be arrested under the Workmen's Combination Act. And what Geldard was doing here, and what the crowd as a whole was doing here, was perceived to be chargeable under that act. Geldard was sentenced to 6 weeks hard labour in Preston House of Correction. Interestingly, the magistrates claimed that this was a lenient sentence because they could, if they enacted the full force of the law, have given him 3 months imprisonment in Preston House of Correction. They give him 6 weeks and they say, we're being lenient here because this is the first example of this. But they do state, the magistrates, that they are fully determined to protect those who choose to work for what wages they please. In other words, the magistrates are very firm on this. We are not going to accept any episodes of intimidation. There is another case. On the same day, the assault and intimidation of Mary Leonard. Mary Leonard is a 20-year-old Irish woman. She'd been living in Preston for several years. She's in the 1851 census, so we know she was in Preston for a while. Prior to this event. She also worked at the same mill. She lived all the way down here, just off Heatley Street. If anyone knows Preston, this is Friargate here. She lived just off Friargate, near Heatley Street. It's around 1/4 of a mile. The red line depicts the journey that she took, having left the mill to getting home. And she claimed that throughout this whole journey, she was kind of harangued and attacked by a large crowd, the same crowd that had waited for Alexander Kay. This is her testimony. She said, "I left work on Monday night at 6 o'clock, and so a great crowd of persons assembled outside the gate. The crowd called me a knobstick. I was thrown down once or twice in Byron Street, which is this street here. I was shoved several times. I was not able to go any further and got hold of a lamppost for support. Around Byron Street, she actually ran through a shop, into the back of a shop, and hid in a privy, and the crowd chased her in there and dragged her out of the privy and brought her back onto the street." She says, "I was in the streets from 6 o'clock till 8, so for 2 hours, and was followed and abused by a crowd of persons all the time. I was thrown down a great many times, and I could hardly walk." It does appear that she had to recover from this for a few weeks, by the way. So it does appear that it was a serious attack. It was never life-threatening, it appears, but it was certainly serious and it was certainly violent. Several young people, again, are arrested following this incident. 4 boys, aged 13, 14, 16, and 17. Their ages actually are disputed. It does appear that the 13-year-old is probably more like 11. The 14-year-old probably more like 12. But, they were young adults, young teenagers, young children, and young adults. Each was accused of intimidating and assaulting Leonard. Several witnesses testified against the boys, including some of those who were involved in the attack. It does appear that they were kind of advised that if you give evidence that leads to a charge, then you won't be charged yourselves. So there was some evidence that evidence came from those who were themselves involved. The magistrates concluded that such disgraceful outrages should be prevented. The two older boys this time faced the full brunt of the law. They were sentenced to 3 months imprisonment, and the two younger ones to 6 weeks imprisonment. These sentences were later overturned on appeal because the evidence that was used to convict them was pretty flimsy. So there are two instances of intimidation and violence that occur right at the beginning of this dispute. Now, there are different ways of reading these cases. The traditional view of reading these, and the way in which they're depicted, certainly in Dutton and King's book, is that this is just an example of the authorities using their power to kind of combat this strike activity at a very early phase in the dispute. In other words, to try and put down the dispute, make sure that it doesn't kind of grow. So, young boys and men were arrested and imprisoned in relatively punitive sentences, actually, even though the authorities themselves claimed otherwise. They also used these instances to ban open-air meetings after sunset. So just a couple of days after they occurred, on the 16th of September, the authorities banned open-air meetings after sunset. So, the kind of large gatherings of people waiting outside mills was prohibited from this time. So to read Dutton and King and other studies, this is just an episode of power enacted by the authorities. And I think that's true. Clearly that was the intention. But there is another way to read these as well. And I think this is what I try and emphasize in this article. The incidents and it's to try and give agency to the workers themselves. To me, the incident outside Hawkins Mill, yes, in terms of the response, was an episode of power from the authorities, but the incident itself marked a deliberate display of power by the operatives. This was them showing very clearly that we're not going to accept people going and working in the mills and undermining the strike. That if you go into the mills and kind of undermine what we're trying to achieve with our collective action, then life will not be very nice for you. In other words, it's an attempt to intimidate. It's probably an attempt to sow solidarity amongst the ranks of the workers themselves and to stop others from going to work. Because they know what they will face if they do. So it signals the danger of acting against the collective. So that's kind of my interpretation and what I try and emphasize in this article. What I also try to do is provide some context to this term knobstick. Now, the term knobstick is probably best associated with the Preston strike and lockout, but it was by no means from this period. Actually, it originates in a much earlier period and was well known by the 1850s. I've actually been doing some follow-up work on this with Dr. Jack Southern at the University of Central Lancashire, looking at the origins and the kind of legacy of the term knobstick. This is something that was still very much work in progress. But what we find is that it originates in the late 18th century in terms of, knobstick describes a walking stick. That's the kind of where the term first comes from. But in terms of a kind of industrial relations context, we do see it used from the late 18th century in southeast Lancashire, so Manchester, Stockport area, to describe either workers who work during strikes or employers who employ knobstick labourers or blackleg labourers. It's probably a more popular term. So the origins is the 18th century. It's certainly by the 1850s a well-established term. And there's a kind of long history of knobsticks, facing kind of violence and intimidation during moments of industrial action. So arrests for harassment or intimidation and physical attacks on knobsticks were not uncommon in the 1830s and 1840s, and there's lots of reports on this in the newspapers. When Engels wrote about the northern working class in his Condition of the Working Class in England, which was first published in 1844, he observed that knobsticks are usually threatened, insulted, beaten, or otherwise maltreated by members of the union, intimidated, in short, in every way. So, by the 1850s, by the time of the Preston strike and lockout, there was a kind of long history of kind of use of the term knobstick to kind of, I think, to sow solidarity amongst the workers, but also to kind of intimidate those who didn't support strike action. And it certainly becomes a powerful rhetorical device during the Preston strike. There's loads of examples of this, by the way. I've taken a few here from the newspapers, but there's many more. So the the strike becomes a lockout in October 54, and from that point until it becomes a strike again in February 54, there's very little examples of kind of intimidation and violence because everyone's locked out. So there's no people can break a strike when there's a general lockout. We see this occur again in 54 when the mills start to open, and lots of people are brought before the authorities on the charge that they've been intimidating workers and trying to stop them going to work. So a few examples here. Striker Sarah Bradley was charged with shouting to a female operative at a mill, coming out, leaving a mill in April 1854. It's you, you bugger. I'm talking to you. You're a damn knobstick. And if you don't come out, I'll mob you. She was later charged with actually physically assaulting the person that she shouted this to. Edward Woods at a large meeting of the Preston operatives in April 54 says, let there be no knobsticks amongst you. In other words, it's kind of, I think the use of the term knobstick was a kind of othering of those who didn't support the strike. And it was again a way of maintaining collective solidarity by othering those who didn't support collective action. I thought this was really interesting as well. Thomas Banks later reflected on the strike and lockout. He was a secretary of the Preston Spinners Union. And he said in 1894, so he would have been a young man at the time of this dispute, he said, we are in possession of records of every man who ran the blockade during the strike and earned himself the nickname of Knobstick. I thought it was quite interesting because it just shows that they were keeping registers of these people. If you go and work in the mills, we will remember you. And, and it's, and one can only imagine the kind of fear that would have, the kind of fear of the kind of breaking the strike that would have kind of immersed amongst the workers and probably prevented some of them from going back to the mills, keeping records of those who were involved. So lots of other disturbances. So the onset of the lockout in 53, as I mentioned, appears to end instances of violence and intimidation because you can't break a strike in a lockout because the mills are locked out. The mills are shut, so, the workers are locked out. Cases reappear when the mills begin to open again in January, February of 1854. What we find is lots of reports of strikers assembling outside the mills every day. Dickens himself, actually, when he comes to Preston in February, reports on this. He observes mill workers being escorted into the mills, striking workers being escorted into the mills by the police and being escorted out of the mills by the police. So it just gives a sense that there was a very serious threat to those who were going into the mills. So large crowds assemble daily outside or near to the mills. Knobsticks receive police escorts. Many are arrested for obstructing and shouting knobstick at workers. Some of those charged are women, such as the examples that I gave earlier. There is an escalation of intimidation following the arrival of knobstick labourers from Preston in late February, and there is a serious disturbance on the night of the 2nd of March, 1854, which I'll go through now. I know we're sort of hitting the 45-minute mark, so I don't want to go too much longer. But I'll just explain this particular episode because I think it's probably it is the most serious actually of the lockout, and I think more than anything really undermines this idea that this was an entirely peaceful dispute. So, as I mentioned, knobstick labourers have been brought into Preston from February 54. They always came in via the train station here, and large crowds began to assemble around the train station to kind of welcome those who came in. And the idea was to, and actually in many instances, those who were brought in were kind of convinced to turn around and go back the other way. On the night of the 2nd of March, a large crowd of hundreds of men and women waited outside at Preston train station for the arrival of knobstick labourers from Kirby Lonsdale, which is a few miles outside of Preston. They were brought in by Messrs. G&A Lee, who owned Brookhouse Mill up here in North Preston. So the Preston train station is circled down here. Brookhouse Mill is all the way up here. And when they were brought in, carts were waiting for them to transport them up to Brookhouse Mill. Upon arrival, the workers were taken towards the mill in a cavalcade of carriages. They were put on carriages and escorted there by the police in order to prevent them from any disruption. And they were followed by a large crowd of strikers shouting knobsticks and hooting. And as they made the way towards the mill, particularly as they got towards Fylde Road, what we find are reports of crowds waiting for them, throwing stones and kind of horse dung and other things at these carriages as they were kind of working their way towards the mill. there are women and men and children involved amongst the workers, by the way. And one of the reports stated that a young child in one of the carriages was actually hit by a stone and caused quite a serious injury. When they arrived at the mill, the windows of the mill were broken and a large crowd assembled and started shouting knobsticks and doing the usual thing. And the police were brought in and dispersed the crowd. And the following day, the magistrates issued a proclamation banning further meetings in Preston. So from this point onwards, the large assemblages of striking workers took place at Wantley Dale outside Preston, couldn't take place anymore inside Preston. And a couple of weeks later, most of the union leaders were arrested. So the authorities really clamped down on strike activity from this point, and and this episode was used as an example of this. And it's a pretty serious episode. It was reported in the local press as a kind of riotous proceeding. The magistrates considered reading the Riot Act, but didn't, but could have done. And we might have had an episode that was somewhat similar to the Plug Plot riots of the early 40s had they done. So just to bring this to a close, the lockout occurred at a relatively early stage of industrial factory-based trade unionism. The 1850s was still relatively early in terms of kind of large numbers of people working in factories. Labour disputes from the 1850s are usually considered generally peaceful compared to the revolutionary fervour of earlier decades, and it's certainly true that the Preston strike was devoid of the politics that I think had underpinned a lot of earlier industrial disputes, and certainly like the violence of some of those early disputes. However, this is the argument that I make in the article and that I've kind of hinted at here in these series of case studies. While the operatives were kind of overwhelmingly peaceful, there was no kind of big mob violence or crowd violence or anything like that. Intimidation, I argue, was a central, though informal, factor in the maintenance of the strike and was used, particularly the term knobstick, to sow collective solidarity. Violence was exceptional and strongly discouraged by the strike leaders, but was more common than has been supposed, and the epithet knobstick othered those who did not support collective action and galvanized solidarity, and deliberately so, amongst the striking operatives.